Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival. It's good to hear that there are lots of people joining us here this afternoon. And I'd like to start by thanking the Wigtown Book Festival and its sponsors for organizing this afternoon's conversation. And I'd like to make a special mention of Nicola Wood, who's a trustee of the festival, and Alexander McCall-Smith, who invited me here today. My name is William Hanna, and I'm proud to say that my ancestors came from Wigtown. But I was actually born and bred in Belfast, as was the person I'm here today to introduce to you, someone who has been called one of the finest lyric poets of our time, Michael Longley. Michael, hello. It's a great honor for me to talk to you this afternoon.
And my delight to be talking to you.
Great. So, Michael, perhaps for those joining us who may be new to your work or need a reminder, I should say that you've won many prizes for your poetry. You hold honorary doctorates from Queen's University Belfast and from Trinity in Dublin. You've been elected a Freeman of the City of Belfast. You're a recipient of the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, and you've also been awarded the CBE. And a book has been written about your writing called Reading Michael Longley. And in that book, Fran Brereton has written, part of the pleasure of reading Michael Longley is the extent to which his poems have the capacity to surprise, to alter perception, to make us see on more than one level simultaneously, to combine an immediacy and physicality with a sense of mystery. Michael, you've just brought out a new collection called the Candlelight Master, and I have it here, and I can show our viewers. And I know this is available. It's available to be purchased on the Wigtown online festival site. So that's your latest collection, Michael. Is that your 12th poetry collection?
Yes, my 12th. Imagine, yes.
Michael, perhaps I should explain a little bit why we are both here today. And it's your friend Derek Mahan who wrote a poem for your 70th birthday in which he said, it all began at Inst. And that's where our connection began because you were my English teacher at Inst.
God, I did quite a good job.
Royal Belfast Academical Institution, for those who don't know it. But that was back in 1967, 68. You haven't changed so much since then.
Well, you've changed quite a bit.
I've changed a bit, but this festival is the first time we have met. We've met online. It's the first time we've met since then. But in a way, I feel I know you well because I've been carrying your books of poetry around with me around the world and reading them for a long time. Michael, what I'd like to do today is to explore with you some of the themes that you were writing about way back in Belfast in the 1960s, and you're still writing about them today. And for our audience and viewers, I'm going to ask Michael to read as many of his poems as possible over this hour. But if you already know Michael's work and you have a favorite poem, you can maybe send us a message and we'll see whether we'll be able to read that at the end. And if you're new to Michael's work, you're in this afternoon for a real treat. So start for 10, Michael. First theme that I remember is classics, a classical theme. I remember when we were at school and I was in your class, Form 3, back in Belfast. I remember that we studied the Odyssey with you. We studied in English, of course, you have it in the original, but the Odyssey and the Iliad, you come back to these frequently in your poetry. Can you tell us why these texts are so important to you? And could you read us something from your classical canon?
Yes, well, of course, the Iliad, I've said before, is our greatest poem, I think, about war and death. And the Odyssey is just this wonderful first European novel in a way. Both books, but especially the Iliad, I think are bottomless. And I feel as though, having written many poems out of Homer, I'm still only scratching the surface. But I'd like to begin with a poem which goes back to 1965, shortly after I was married, and it's called Persephone. Now, Persephone ate the seed of the forbidden pomegranate, and her punishment was she had spent 6 months in the underworld and then 6 months among us. It's kind of the Adam and Eve Greek style. And it's an explanation way, a mythological explanation of the phenomenon of summer and winter, really. So I'll read this as our first poem, William.
Great.
And remembering Inst and you in Form 3. I did quite a good job on you, I think. Yeah, Persephone. I see as through a skylight in my brain, the mole strew its buildings in the rain. The swallows turn above their broken home, and all my acres in delirium. Straight-jacketed by cold and numbskulled, now sleep the well-adjusted and the skilled. The bat folds its wing like a winter leaf. The squirrel in its hollow holds aloof. The weasel and ferret, the stoat and fox, move hand in glove across the equinox. I can tell how softly their footsteps go. Their footsteps borrow silence from the snow. The last line again is, their footsteps borrow silence from the snow. I wrote that a long time ago. I'm still fond of it. And many years later in Italy, in Tuscany, I was looking out the bathroom window down to the village of Cardozo, and there was this old man tending his vines. And I thought he could be Laertes from the Odyssey, the father of Odysseus. And then I thought he could be my father. And now I think at 81 that he could be me, for God's sake. But here's a poem which derives straight really from Homer, called Laertes. And you've got to remember that when Odysseus returned home after 20 years, he was in disguise, and also his father hadn't seen him for 20 years. So he gradually, for reasons was too complicated for the poem, he reveals gradually to Laertes that he is in fact Odysseus. And Laertes is having a nervous breakdown in misery because he's missing his son and he doesn't know that standing in front of him is his beloved son. And in the poem, William, I'm very delighted to use a Belfast word, which you know, duncher, which is a flat cap, Laertes. So all in one sentence. When he found Laertes alone on the tidy terrace, hoeing around a vine, disreputable in his gardening duds, patched and grubby, leather gaiters protecting his shins against brambles, gloves as well, and to cap it all, sure sign of his deep depression, a goatskin dungeon. Odysseus sobbed in the shade of a pear tree for his father, so old and pathetic that all he wanted then and there was to kiss him and hug him and blurt out the whole story. But the whole story is one catalogue and then another. So he waited for images from that formal garden, evidence of a childhood spent traipsing after his father and asking for everything he saw. The 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, 40 fig trees, the 50 rows of vines ripening at different times for a continuous supply. Until Laertes recognized his son, and, weak at the knees, dizzy, flung his arms around the neck of great Odysseus, who drew the old man fainting to his breast and held him there, and cradled like driftwood the bones of his dwindling father.
Wow. Very gentle poems, Michael. I find that very moving. The first one, the Persephone, is from way at the beginning of your No Continuing City, and Laertes is from, I think, from Gorse Fires, which is much later. I was noticing in your collected poems, you have Laertes on the same page as a little poem called Northern Lights.
Yeah.
And in that poem, you have you're with your father, and he has his hand on your shoulder, and you're looking out at the Black Mountain at the Northern Lights. And I thought that's a lovely poem to go with it. Another
yes,
poem.
well, I do quite a lot of that, twinning poems. As
Twin
it were.
the poem, yeah. You twin the poems, but you also have very contrasting styles, because those are gentle poems from the classical time. But many of these classical poems, and indeed many of your poems about with the classical background, are quite violent and talk of the violence of war. So there's the gentleness, and there's also the violence. And I was remembering, and I was just talking to another friend who was at school with us back in Belfast, and he was saying that he remembered from the time of your classes that they had to study some rather dull poetry book, but you supplemented it with cyclostyle copies of war poems, the First World War poems. And I think we were all struck by those poems, and particularly by the ones by Wilfred Owen. And you yourself have written many powerful poems about the First World War. Your father was a distinguished soldier. He was awarded the Military Cross. Do you think he was haunted by his experiences? And could you read us perhaps something about your father and that war theme?
Yes, well, indeed. He was a distinguished soldier. He joined up, when he was only about 17. And by the time he was 20, he was a captain in charge of a company of young soldiers, many of them not regular shavers. They were so young. And he was a captain. He'd won the Military Cross for gallantry. And although he was a successful soldier, he chose, like many survivors, not to talk about it. And I've written a lot of poems about him. And in a way, he died when I was only 20. In a way, those poems are the conversations with him that I wish I had had. And it seems to me there's no future for poetry unless it does look into the blackness, into the pit, into the abyss, into the world of violence. And I have written, and one of the titles I quite like is when people talk of me as a war poet. I prefer it when they talk of me as a love poet or a nature poet. But yes, I have written a number of poems, and I remember William bringing back from school a mouth organ, a harmonica, and my dad, and I'd never heard him play anything. He picked it up and he played it quite well. And it transpired that he had, and some of his mates in the trenches had taught themselves to play the harmonica. And they had little impromptu marching bands with the harmonica. And it's such a beautiful story. And I wanted for years to write a poem about it, but I couldn't. It was too powerful. And then I was reading a book about the early Greek philosophers. And there's this Greek philosopher, I forget what his dates are, a long time ago. And he believed that creation was made of air, that air was the basis of creation. And he breathed life into this poem, Harmonica, which I'll read now, if I can find it. It's this, by the way, William, is of all the poems I've written, this is my favorite. And it's only 7 lines long. Now, that may say something in itself. And I refer to a music hall favorite, and you can choose your own music hall favorite. But the one that I have at the back of my mind when I read the line is, "It's a long way to Tipperary," which I can't hear without wanting to shed a tear. Harmonica. A Tommy drops his harmonica in no man's land. My dad, like old Anaximenes, breathes in and out through the holes and reeds and finds this melody. Our souls are air. They hold us together. Listen. A music hall favorite lasts until the end of time. My dad is playing it. His breath contains the world. The wind is playing an orchestra of harmonicas. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Again, that's a very gentle poem.
Yeah. Well, my best known poem is what you might call a troubles poem, but it's about the First World War as well. Although that's very oblique. It's called Ceasefire.
Yes.
And before I read it, perhaps I'll do there's a tiny little squib before a tiny little squib in my last book.
Perhaps, Michael, I was thinking, in a way, we're moving from the First World War to the Troubles, and I just want to ask you, because I suppose in the 1960s, it was about 50 years after the end of the First World War, that you were beginning to write about identity and conflict in Northern Ireland. I was just in my teens at the time. You were probably in your early 20s. Did you suspect, because it's back in 67, did you suspect that the Troubles were coming and that they would lead to such violence? Did you know beforehand? And indeed, read us your poems about that time, because these poems have touched many people, and I think they've been very important poems. But I'm curious about where this came from. Did it surprise you?
Well, I knew that things weren't right, and I rather disapproved of the unionist oligarchy. But for instance, the fact that I cycle-styled poems, say McNeice and Kavanagh and poets like that, was because they weren't in the anthologies.
Yes.
We were encouraged, our education, even in an excellent school, encouraged us to forget the fact that we were on an island called Ireland, and that we might as well have been living in Wolverhampton or Bolton.
Yeah.
So nevertheless, and then I supported the civil rights movement. But when it was 1969, when the Troubles erupted, I was flabbergasted by the ferocity of it all, and I had no idea there was so much hatred. And I mean, I came from a very liberal background. There wasn't a touch of sectarianism in my parents or in our household. So I was flabbergasted by the ferocity of it all. And I still am, really. And there was a little squib in my last book. It's just a few lines. And it's my summing up of it, really, in a way. The Troubles. Think of the children behind the coffins. Look sorrow in the face. Call those 30 years the years of disgrace. Yeah. And here's the poem Ceasefire, which is, in a way, it's my best known poem. In fact, sometimes I get fed up with it. You'd think I'd written nothing else. And this is about the old King Priam, of the King of Troy, plucking up courage and going to visit Achilles in his tent to beg for the body of his son Hector, whom Achilles has killed in combat. And I had in the back of my mind a face for Priam, I thought of Gordon Wilson. You remember the draper whose daughter was killed beside him in the Enniskillen Remembrance Day ball. Yes. So I think of him when I read this poem. Ceasefire. Put in mind of his own father and moved to tears. Achilles took him by the hand and pushed the old king gently away. But Priam curled up at his feet and wept with him until their sadness filled the building. Taking Hector's corpse into his own hands, Achilles made sure it was washed and, for the old king's sake, laid out in uniform, ready for Priam to carry, wrapped like a present, home to Troy at daybreak. When they'd eaten together, it pleased them both to stare at each other's beauty as lovers might. Achilles built like a god, Priam good-looking still and full of conversation, who earlier had sighed, I get down on my knees and do what must be done, and kiss Achilles' hand, the killer of my son.
Wonderful. Yes. I know that poem so well, and I think it came out at a very important time. It was published just at a time when things were changing. So it perhaps said it was a poem of its moment, but I think it's still relevant to us today.
Yes, something very simple happens in Homer after this very highly charged meeting.
Yeah.
They're both exhausted. And Achilles says to Priam, he said, oh, come on, let's have something to eat. And they sit down at a table and they share food. And that sacramental moment, in a way, resolves everything. And in a way, the episode of Priam's visit to Achilles is, for me, the soul of the Iliad. And it really, the simple message is talk to each other and look one another in the eye. And it's harder to be hateful and violent.
Indeed. I was just thinking also in your most recent collection in the Candlelight Master, you've picked up again the themes of war. I was particularly struck by one of the poems about Wilfred Owen. Again, a lovely poem, because you were reading, I think you were reading in Craig Lockhart, where the officers went after they were wounded in the First World War, and you were actually there, and you read a poem about Wilfred Owen, and I love the way you're still in that poem, just hoping you might make it to the other side. It's a lovely poem.
Yeah, well, my wife and I visited the canal. There's a little place called Ors, O-R-S.
Yeah.
And we stood at the spot. Wilfred and his men were building pontoons to cross the canal, and a sniper killed him. But you stand there.
And as you say, the German sniper doesn't know his poetry. It's a very striking poem, and it's such an irony.
Yeah.
So war and has been a theme, and it became very relevant to us in Belfast. I think perhaps when we started studying with you, we were studying something that was from the past, and then it suddenly became actual and in the present. And your poems were very relevant for that. But we should move over, because you said earlier you'd like to be known. You're happy to be known as a war poet, but also you'd like to be known as a love poet, and I think you are. Your love poetry. So something completely different. And I know that the first poem in your first collection is a love poem. But you've told me also that you consider your poems about nature, about birds and wildflowers are also love poems. You've written so many poems about birds. The wren is one on the front of the collected edition. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the birds. And what do you think your role can be? Can your poems about birds protect them? And would you read us a poem about a bird? Choose one for us today from your nature poems or your love poetry.
Well, I think the birds will protect me and you. I don't think there's any future for us on this globe if we're incapable of making space for beautiful creatures like birds. But since boyhood, I've been fascinated by birds. Mm-hmm. And I read this poem called Swan's Mating, which is quite early, but it's a poem that I'm still fond of. And it has a lovely word in it, pen, which is the female swan. And cob, of course, is the male. Swan's Mating. Even now, I wish that you had been there, sitting beside me on the riverbank, the cob and his pen sailing in rhythm until their small heads met, and the final heraldic moment dissolved in ripples. This was a marriage and a baptism, a holding of breath, nearly a drowning. Wings spread wide for balance where he trod, her feathers full of water, and her neck under the water like a bar of light. And loads of poems about birds in my
that's one of the first ones, and I think my wife was very struck by that poem. It's a lovely poem from I think from the very beginning, from your earliest collection. But you've been writing. You continue to write in some. It's as if you've chosen every species of bird in Ireland and you've written about each one.
Oh,
do you have a new one?
There are a few left that I haven't touched on. You know, yeah, I have one here called about the flycatcher.
Uh-huh.
Lovely little bird, and it mentions my granddaughter Amelia, and a dead flycatcher. That's her drawing of the flycatcher. Can you see
right.
it? Yeah. Flycatcher. A new poem. A flycatcher crashed against the window. Amelia cradled the corpse in her hands and tried to breathe life into breast speckles, imagining a mossy clearing where shadowy trees intertwine, branches from which to loop and glide and arrow swift chase butterflies and stinging bees. A fledgling like herself, wing flurry flashing in the sun, a little bird practicing its name and trajectory.
Lovely, and that's new. That's you haven't published that one yet.
No, I haven't published it. And can I read another birdie one?
Please do. I love them.
Which is about it mentions the virus. I hate poetry that tries to be up to date and topical, you know. But anyway, this is such a huge catastrophe. It's hard to ignore it. But this is a little poem about me not being able to go to the west of Ireland because of the lockdown. I've called it Isolation. Another new poem, William. Old age and the virus keep me from driving west to join sanderlings along the shoreline, oyster catchers beyond, hoopers on the lake, tufted ducks and coots, and the heron waiting, acrobatic chuffs and talkative ravens, otters effervescent between trout and elver, stoat and hare sharing our rock of the wall fern. And that last line, the rock of the wall fern, is really a translation of Corrick Skewan, the place where we go, Corrick Skewan.
I see. I was gonna ask you about that. These birds have taken us. I think some of there's a flycatcher. I think in Scotland, isn't it? It's in western Scotland that you find the flycatcher.
Yes, that's right.
Your other birds are often in Carrick-Skewan in Mayo. I think it's a place. It's a townland that I know, and many people know through your poetry. And I was going to ask you, are you still able to go there? But I suppose for the last while you haven't been able to. So you have it in your head, and you remember it through the poems.
Well, yes, I refer to it as my soul landscape, to which is now added Loch Alsh in Scotland, where my daughter lives. But
when did you first go to Mayo? When did you first discover this place?
It was 1970. So we've been going there every year for 50 years. And it's now sort of has seeped into my synapses to such an extent that I don't need to go back. Although I have to go, I will have to go back. It's a state of mind, if you like, for me. And I owe it to a very, very great ornithologist called David Cabot, perhaps Ireland's greatest ornithologist. It's his cottage. And since 1970, he's allowed me and my family to squat there, which is a huge privilege. And it's also a huge privilege to go out in the field, as it were, with him. An afternoon in the company of David Cabot is worth about 3 years in a library. And I've learned more and more, I suppose, about the wildflowers and the wild birds. And they, in a way, are what preoccupy me. My dear friend, the late Kieran Carson, used to talk jokingly and disparagingly about, as he called them, your wee poems about swans and primroses, you know. But in a way, if we don't look after the swans and the herons and the wild birds and the wild thyme and the cowslips, we're finished. We shall have destroyed the globe, and with it ourselves.
Yeah, I sometimes, I suppose, going back to Belfast, I see you as a city poet in a way, because you lived in the same part of the city that I lived, and we went down to school in the center of that big city. But you've been in the countryside since the very beginning. One of my favorite poems of yours is the Wren. I remember it was published in a newspaper. It is separate from other collections, and in that you begin it by saying you've been writing too much about Carrick-Skewan, but you still write about it. It still inspires you. Have you another poem about that place? Am I pronouncing it correctly? Carrick-Skewan.
No, that's perfect. The thing about it is, I love it so deeply because I'm a city boy.
Huh.
You know, I wasn't brought up in a farm or anything like that. You know, I was brought up in a suburb of Belfast, off Balmoral Avenue, which you will know. And this poem is about being in Belfast and remembering Carrick-Skewan, remembering my soul landscape. It's a kind of a failed sonnet, remembering Carrick-Skewan. A wintry night, the hearth inhales, and the chimney becomes a windpipe, fluffy with soot and thistledown, a voice box recalling animals. The leveret come of age, snipe at an angle, then the porpoise's demonstration of meaningless smiles. Home is a hollow between the waves, a clump of nettles, feathery winds, and memory no longer than a day when the animals come back to me from the townland of Carrick-Skewan, from a page lit by the Milky Way.
Lovely poem, and it's a lovely place. And as I say, I feel I know that place, although I've never been there, but through reading your different poems about it, and another thing that really struck me and recently was the wren, and there's another poem as well. You write a lot about your grandchildren. And you dedicate your poems to them, and you actually write about them. And that one was about the flycatcher was about one of your grandchildren. That's been, and I've become a grandfather recently. In fact, a few grandchildren now, and one of them is old enough to read your poems. But you celebrate them very much in your poetry.
Well, it's a huge gift. It's about the only good thing about growing old. Is acquiring grandchildren, and you acquire a new title. I mean, I'm now Papa, and it's like being promoted for doing nothing.
Yeah.
And
it's right. And I listen with this virtual world, we're talking to them on all the time and they're beginning to recognize us through images rather than through actually seeing them.
Yes. Well, I listen to everything they say, and some of the wonderful things they say get into poems. And one of my granddaughters, Maisie, said something interesting to my daughter, Sarah. And Sarah said, "What was that?" And she says, "I won't tell you because you'll only tell Papa and he'll put it in a poem." Yeah. But I am, in fact, my next book, I have about 3/4 of a new collection. Since lockdown, I've written more than I normally write in about 2 years. So I have the guts of a new book, which is called The Slain Birds. It takes it. The title, the epigraph will be from Dylan Thomas. For the sake of the souls of the slain birds flying, the slain birds, with the implications there. And as I say, it's nearly finished, and I'm dedicating it to all 7 of my grandchildren because, they are poems in themselves, each one of them.
It's interesting what you're saying. I mean, and you're writing about the lockdown and the difficulties people are having. But listening to the opening item in the Wigton Festival, Alexander McCall Smith was saying this that lockdown has given artists the chance to write more. So that's been a positive thing. You have to. You're locked and you can't get out. So maybe this whole period will be productive with poets and also with writers.
Yes, well, it has been for me time for rumination and reverie. And
could I ask you to read one for my grandson, who's 10 years old now, and it's the one, it's the companion one to the Wren, which is the Leveret. Could you read that one to us?
Yes. This happened when my grandson Ben, who's now 17 and very manly, and he's captain of the first 15 in Edinburgh. He plays the saxophone. He's an accomplished young man now. But when he first came to Corrigskeewan, he was just a babe in arms, and there'd been so much rain that the river, the local river, the Owen or Donan, was in spate, and he and his father and mother could only get across in a neighbour's tractor. And this is a poem about that, the Leveret, for my grandson Ben. This is your first night in Corrigskeewan. The Owen or Donan is so full of rain. You arrived in Paddy Morrison's tractor, a bumpy approach in your father's arms, to the cottage where, all of 1 year ago, you were conceived, a fire seed in the hearth. Did you hear the wind in the fluffy chimney? Do you hear the wind tonight, and the rain, and a shorebird calling from the mussel reefs? Tomorrow I'll introduce you to the sea, little hoplite. Have you been missing it? I'll park your chariot by the Otter's Rock and carry you over seaweed to the sea. There's a tufted duck on David's Lake, with her suit full of hatchlings, pom-poms a day old and already learning to dive. We may meet the stoat near the erratic boulder, a shrew in his mouth, or the merlin meadow pipit hunting. But don't be afraid. The leveret breakfasts under the fuchsia every morning, and we shall be watching. I have picked wildflowers for you, scabious and century, in a jam jar of water that will bend and magnify the daylight. This is your first night in Carrick's-Kewan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that one. I'm just getting a couple of questions that are coming through from audience and people listening in. And one of them is a little bit more about the question of creativity. And it's asking, when you're feeling creatively challenged or low in inspiration, what do you do to overcome it? That's the first question.
I keep quiet and I don't write. I think one has to be taken by surprise. I've said somewhere, I don't know where poems come from, and if I did, I would go there. But the poetry, and in my book, it cannot be an act of the will. I have to be taken by surprise. And if I'm not taken by surprise, nobody else is going to be taken by surprise. What I do is I try not to sit down and fake it. The only poems that are worth keeping are the poems which came and forced themselves into being. One's got to be a little bit like the woman who's having a baby on a transatlantic flight. All she does is she lies down in the middle of the aisle and out it comes. And good poetry has to be like that too. It has to be born.
And another question coming from the audience. Who do you read of today's younger generation of poets? Who do you read?
I like Belfast poet Leontia Flynn. I think she's very good. That's the sort of question. I mean, there's probably a queue of them out there waiting to be mentioned. And Edna, who else would you? Just refuse to comment. Yeah, it's probably better not to name any of them, you know. If I name them, I'm bound to leave somebody out.
You do read a lot of other poetry coming out now from younger poets.
I read a certain amount. I think it's important to keep in touch with the young, and it's important though not to lose touch with the dead great ones. So just recently, I've been reading Shelley, and I mentioned Leontia Flynn, her lovely booklet of poems, which take off from Catullus, which are kind of very, very humorous refractions of Catullus. Yes, I do. Yeah, I keep my ears open, but I think a good poem is a rare event. I think what was it? There's an American poet, a dear old American poet that I met when he was 100, called anyway, he said, what was his name?
Stanley Kunitz.
Sorry, getting time. Stanley Kunitz, and he said that the energy soon leaks out of an ill-made thing. I mean, there's a pejorative term. People use it pejoratively, the well-made poem. I hate that. I hate that term. because you might as well talk about a well-made flower or a well-made snowflake. The form is inherent. And Kunitz says form is about the conservation of energy. And I find there's an awful lot of prolixity, long-windedness. Most of the contemporary poems I read are too long.
Uh-huh.
And I think, you could lose a line there, lose a line there, lose a stanza there, and boom. So I do keep up, but there's a kind of trendy prolixity which I find tiresome. I find the way mediocre prose is promoted as breakthrough poetry, and I don't really find much to enjoy there. But occasionally it's wonderful to find a new poem. That was written, say, just last week. I love that. And there's a lot of poetic activity here in Belfast. I was asked on an American radio station why so much poetry came out of Belfast, out of the north, and I said it was a joke. It didn't get one titter. And I said because of our water supply. It comes from a place called the Silent Valley.
Silent Valley, the Silent Valley, yes, yeah. I mean, my own. As I said, I've been following your poetry since you taught it. And I remember you didn't read your poetry to us when we were in your class, and your poetry was always the form was always very important. I mean, I think in your early poems, the form and the structure was extremely tight and. But you've moved in more recently to freer poems. Is that just and poems which I think are easier for people to understand at first sight. They maybe have different layers, but I think your poetry would that be fair to say that your poetry has become easier to read? Easier?
Yes, I think as I've got older, the work has got simpler. And when I was in my 20s. I worked very, very hard at a poem. And in fact, I probably started to write it too soon so that it was premature when it was finished and had to go into, when I thought it was finished, and it had to go into an incubator. And now I think my sense of timing is better. And if I have to work hard if I have to work hard on a poem the way I did in my 20s, now it will be a failure. It has to come with a certain loose-wristed insouciance now. And I think, and when I revise a poem, I am always trying to make it simpler and clearer. Yes. It's terribly easy to be complicated and obscure. That's dead easy. To be simple and clear, like Patrick Kavanagh or John Clare, is the real challenge. And they would be two of my patron saints.
There's another question, and I think it's on what we've been talking about. This question and comment is coming from Helen. Says it's been a wonderful session, but she says the majority of writers that she's heard speak since March, since lockdown, have said that they've not been able to write or to concentrate. They found it difficult to write and concentrate and read. And she's fascinated to hear you say that something differently. How do you account for that? Is it because of the type of audience you're aiming to? Is it your relationship with your reader? Is it, as you're saying, because with age, you find things come differently? How have you been able to adapt so well to the confinement?
Well, just going on as before, only more so, and with time in my hands. Imagine what Wilfred Owen on leave from the trenches. He would have loved this period. I'm not going to boring meetings. I'm not wasting my time getting drunk in pubs. I'm staying at home. Perhaps I watch a little too much Netflix But by and large, it's time. And I'm married to the best critic in the world, the best poetry critic in the world, as we all know. And there she is. And we can talk and linger over our meals, and we talk poetry a lot. People who say that the lockdown has kept them from writing, I find that nonsensical.
I have another question coming from Anne, and she asks, would you say you're a better poet now than you were when you were younger?
No, different. There's something about the first book which interests me, and I shouldn't say it myself, but impresses me. I think I've just changed, but I'm basically the same poet as I was then. More practiced, fitter, if I may say so, linguistically, and more experience. And but I think the poems in the first book are well made and melodious, and some of them, I shouldn't say pitch perfect. And I'm proud of my first book, and I wouldn't mind ending my days writing the way I did then.
And you mentioned your wife, the critic, and I think you've said, Edna, who's there, and I think you said that you try out your poems with her, and if she says they're okay, you know that they're good poems. And I've got a request from Mrs. MacDonald in Pitlochry, who says she loves your poetry, and she asks you to read one, which is, and so many of your poems are about Edna. This one is The Pattern. A lovely poem that I know. Could you, and that might be the last one that you read. Could you read The Pattern for us?
Yes, I'd love to read it. It's about discovering the Vogue pattern for Edna's wedding dress. 36 years to the day after our wedding, when a cold, figure-revealing wind blew against you and lifted your veil, I find in its fat envelope the 6-shilling Vogue pattern for your bride's dress. Complicated instructions for stitching bodice and skirt, box pleats and hems, tissue paper outlines, semblances of skin which I nervously unfold and hold up in snowlight, for snow has been falling on this windless day, and I glimpse your wedding dress and white shoes outside in the transformed garden, where the clothesline and every twig have been covered.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. I think we might have to wrap up soon. Michael, is there another one you would like to read? Because I've so much enjoyed talking to you today and before is just to hear you talk about the poems, but also read them yourself. Is there one more you'd like to read?
Oh, yeah. Can I just look through? I'll read a love poem.
A love poem. Yes. Yes.
It's only 6 lines long. This is a new one. It's about being old and remembering love. It's called Foam. And now, in my old age, I remember that we made love in the Taliban dunes, not too far away from the Badger's set, and then swam naked at Alaran Point, stepping over otter prints, preserving signs of life, sea foam between our toes.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you today. I've enjoyed this meeting you again after so many years.
Top of the class.
And hearing you share your poems with. As I say, I've taken your poems with me. I've been working around the world in different places, and I've read them in different countries. I remember reading one. Oh, it was a lovely poem. There's the one. What is it called?
Up there.
Up there. Yeah, I was looking for a poem that I could read to a group of European ambassadors.
Yeah.
And I thought, what is a poem that they would get? And it was an Italian poem, and they loved that one. Up there, by it's just a lovely picture from up looking down, a beautiful poem as well. And you're now in your 80s, and I think you're maybe at certain times. A long time ago, you suffered from writer's block, but not at all. At the moment, you tell me you're writing maybe more than ever, which is fantastic. And I think there are lots of questions, again, about what your secret is to be so inspired in these times. But thanks very much for your poetry. And I just want to hold up again the latest one you've published. There'll be another one. This is the Candlelight Master.
Yeah.
It's available in the Wigtown Festival online virtual bookshop. So if anybody's been listening, that's the latest one to get. And also Michael's poetry is the collected poems is one which has the poems up to about 2006, and then there are other volumes. I loved the 100 Doors as well. Was a very good one. So there's so much of your poetry, and it's on sale now from the bookshop. And again, I'd like to thank Wigtown Festival for organizing this. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation as much as I have, do think about Poor Wigtown. Maybe you can make a contribution to their to fund this sort of endeavor. I think in lockdown, difficult for festivals, and well done for Wigtown for keeping a festival going. In spite of all the difficulties. I've been to Wigtown before. I hope we get back to Wigtown and walk around its central square and see all the bookshops.
And thank you very much, William, for being such a sympathetic examiner. But would you now go to the top of the class? Well done.
Thank you very much, Michael. That's fine. Okay. So I think we'll say goodbye from I'm in Brussels, and goodbye from me, and goodbye from Michael in Belfast.
Bye.